The year the Eastern State Penitentiary closed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, many of the inmates were migrated to other prisons across the country, except a handful of those that were on death row or had life sentences. The few that remained were scattered across the large prison, and because there were now fewer people and little to no interaction between them, the inmates began to live in their own imaginations, one of which had driven the youngest inmate in the prison to bang his head against the wall of his cell till his skull cracked and his brain splattered on the ground. Needless to say, he didn't remain alive. It didn't take long before another inmate followed suit. This time, it was an old man who was known for his good-natured behaviour and positivity, regardless of how he'd been serving time over 4 decades. His suicide note had been oddly similar to that of the young inmate, but what made it all the more bizarre was the fact that both inmates had never had any kind of interaction prior to their deaths. Even after the third death, which bore the same striking similarities as the others to be a coincidence, the guards in charge of the prison didn't think it was worth reporting such a development to their superiors until 15 more inmates died. Deaths occurred just a week after the first death, and always their suicide notes carried the same message in different words. This is hell. Afterwards, headquarters ordered the evacuation of some of the other life-term prisoners to other prisons, but the inmates who got there only seemed to replicate the epidemic of suicides they brought with them from the Eastern State Penitentiary. Then they sent in shrinks and priests to the source of the problem in an attempt to fix whatever it was that was going wrong. While shrinks diagnosed that loneliness was driving them crazy, the priest sensed an unholy presence in the vicinity. While Diego was no Christian, he believed the priest more than the psychiatrists when he caught wind of their respective responses. He was also an inmate, one who'd been convicted for the murder of his town's mayor and other serial murders. Diego was already mentally unstable, and he enjoyed his solitude. As a hitman, he'd never had a cause to be lonely, nor did he fear death, and he knew that the things he was beginning to see in the past few days wasn't a result of loneliness or dread filling his insides as his date for the gallows drew nearer. It was something more sinister. It was incomprehensible. It was something from the pits of hell. While the priest suggested a sanctification of the vicinity, management heeded the suggestion of the psychiatrists because it was the most logical thing they could do at that point. They brought the rest of the inmates to a single wing of the prison and made provisions for the inmates' interactions. The canteen was reopened once again, and they'd organised time for game breaks. Visits from the shrinks were also coming in regularly. The reformation plan seemed to be working, as they began counting days with no suicide victims. The success was short-lived, however, because on the morning of 2 weeks with a break in suicides, 22 bodies were harvested from their cells. Some impaled themselves on the cell bars, some bit down on their tongues till they bled to death, while others took a more creative path and clawed out their wrists with screws until they severed their veins. All of them had enough strength to graffiti their blood on the wall in the shape of a letter or a symbol. The warden was confused at first, till he walked down the cell block row of the freshly deceased inmates and began to piece together a grisly message. Gehenna resides within was complete, with no spaces or punctuation. Diego's cell would have been the one with the necessary ending mark, but while he'd hurt himself the night before, he was the only one who survived. However, he didn't make it out unscathed. He plucked out both his eyes. The visits from wardens, shrinks, and even the FBI increased like never before. When Diego regained consciousness in his hospital bed, the miracle inmate and newest blind man didn't bother indulging in the officer's questions. It didn't matter the quantity or quality of incentives they threw his way. He remained impassive. He was so perfectly silent that no one would think he pulled out his tongue along with his eyes. As a last resort to determine just how the inmate had survived, and to figure out if his survival was only temporary, the same Catholic priest who had suggested a cleansing was called upon to have a session with Diego. The priest was genuinely interested in helping the other inmates, so he agreed to the meeting. Surprisingly, Diego interacted with the priest normally when he came, but still would not talk about what happened to him the night before. How could he tell the kind priest that what plagued the prison was no plague of loneliness or demon of death? How could Diego tell the naive priest that the prison was a waypoint to hell, and it was harvesting as many souls as possible because of their innermost guilt? How could he talk of the things he'd seen when he'd been sucked into the dimension of hell? Diego was shaking irreparably. He couldn't even find the words for the scar that his soul would carry for as long as he lived. He'd gouged out his eyes because he wanted to stop seeing the horrors he'd witnessed. But the others, in a bid to make it stop, had taken to much more extreme measures. Diego died exactly 3 minutes after the priest left. He'd somehow managed to steal the priest's huge crucifix and rammed it into his skull before any intervention could be made.
Subscribe today or beware.